Welcome to Woodside Road United Methodist Church. My name is Katie, and it is my pleasure and privilege to serve as pastor of Woodside Road UMC. In our summer of telling family stories, last week we met Jacob, Sarah and Abraham's grandson, and Rebecca and Isaac's younger son. We met him as he was running away from home to his mother's family in order to find a wife. Jacob is in pretty hot water with his brother Esau for buying Esau's birthright and stealing Esau's blessing. Today, we find Jacob having reached his journey at his uncle Laban's home. And Jacob, he is quite enamored with Laban's daughter, Rachel. So Jacob makes a deal with his uncle that he'll work for 7 years in exchange for Rachel in marriage. So now let's listen in on how the trickster, Jacob, gets tricked. Genesis 29:15 through 30. Laban said to Jacob, "You shouldn't have to work for free just because you are my relative. Tell me what you would like to be paid." Now Laban had 2 daughters. The older was named Leah, and the younger Rachel. Leah had delicate eyes, but Rachel had a beautiful figure and was good-looking. Jacob loved Rachel and said, "I will work for you for 7 years for Rachel, your younger daughter." Laban said, "I'd rather give her to you than another man. Stay with me." Jacob worked for Rachel for 7 years. But it seemed like a few days because he loved her. Jacob said to Laban, "The time has come. Give me my wife so that I may sleep with her." So Laban invited all the people of that place and prepared a banquet. However, in the evening, he took his daughter Leah and brought her to Jacob, and he slept with her. Laban had given his servant Zilpah to his daughter, Leah, as her servant. In the morning, there she was, Leah. Jacob said to Laban, "What have you done to me? Didn't I work for you to have Rachel? Why did you betray me?" Laban said, "Where we live, we don't give the younger woman before the oldest. Complete the celebratory week with this woman. Then I will give you this other woman, too, for your work, if you work for me 7 more years. So that is what Jacob did. He completed the celebratory week with this woman, and then Laban gave him his daughter Rachel as his wife. Laban had given his servant Bilhah to his daughter Rachel as her servant. Jacob slept with Rachel, and he loved Rachel more than Leah. He worked for Laban 7 more years. Thus ends the reading. And now may the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. If you call Redwood City home, you may have seen signs at Stolstaff Park warning about the presence of coyotes in the park. Included in these signs are references to calling animal control if you see coyotes carrying boxes marked Acme, exploding TNT, possessing giant magnets, dropping anvils, or offering free birdseed. All of this is, of course, a reference to Wile E. Coyote of Looney Tunes fame, something that needed to be explained to my children since they haven't grown up on Looney Tunes. Wile E. Coyote, while attempting to be tricky, he isn't quite a trickster. His character is played for humor, not reverence. When it comes to the coyote as trickster, Rosalind Curvin, in her 2018 Native American Myths, writes, "He is always male. His shockingly outrageous behavior reinforces a need for correct social norms. However, he is also often a sacred character, playing a dual role and taking on a more sober persona for the purpose of creation or establishing customs. Sound like anyone we know? Over the past few weeks, we've been reading stories about Jacob. First, we read how he and his mother Rebekah tricked Isaac, Jacob's father, and Esau, Jacob's brother. His behavior was outrageous. He bought his brother's birthright for a bowl of soup and stole his brother's blessing. But then last week, we heard the story of Jacob finding himself at a gateway to heaven, hearing directly from God's own self that he would found a great nation. Jacob would then set up a monument and name the place where he heard God's voice, Bethel, the house of God. Our Christian story and the Jewish story from which it comes doesn't have a whole lot of anthropomorphic animals running around in the text. There's a snake who tells Eve at the start of the book of Genesis to eat an apple or a piece of fruit, and a donkey who talks to Balaam in the book of Numbers in order to get him to pay attention to God's messenger. But for the most part, besides these two, messages, wisdom, instruction, and ritual flow directly from God to the people. And so in our case, it's Jacob himself who is the trickster in the story of Genesis. And then, in our reading today, the trickster gets tricked. Jacob, who might also be described as a hustler in less flattering terms, has made his way back to his mother's people and has met Rachel, Laban's younger daughter, whom he wants to marry. So he works for 7 years for Laban in order to be able to marry Laban's daughter. And then, on Jacob and Rachel's wedding night, Laban sends his elder daughter, Leah, off to bed with Jacob. And when Jacob wakes up in the morning, he realizes that he's been tricked. Then, a week later, Jacob is able to marry Rachel as well, in exchange for 7 more years of working for Laban. There's really a lot we could say about all of that. And friends, as much as I like being able to say the trickster gets tricked, this story is basically as messed up as the rest of the stories in the family stories we've been telling this summer. The family dysfunction that began back with Abraham, Sarah, and Hagar has continued through the family line to Abraham and Sarah's grandson, Jacob, and his relationship with his father-in-law / uncle. Because remember, Laban is not only father to Rachel and Leah, but also Rebekah's brother. Through his marriages to Leah and Rachel, Jacob will end up fathering children with 4 different women. The servants mentioned in the text become mothers too. And, of course, Jacob continues to prefer Rachel throughout the course of her life. We hear a lot less, maybe nothing, about Rachel's feelings for Jacob. Along with much of the rest of the nation, we've started introducing our kids to Lin-Manuel Miranda's Hamilton this past week. Because we're almost never quite ready for TV watching until just a few minutes before bedtime, it's going to take us a while to get through Hamilton. But the other night, we were watching the scenes where Alexander Hamilton meets the Schuyler sisters. Watching these numbers involved a lot of pausing the TV to explain that marriage in the not too distant past was not just about love, or maybe not even about love at all sometimes, but also about power, money, and family influence. As the kids went off to bed on Wednesday night, I almost launched into a description of our reading from Genesis this week as another example of marriage taking place in order to fulfill a family obligation. but they really needed to get to bed on Wednesday night, and so I didn't. Sure, Jacob loves Rachel, but his father-in-law/uncle makes him earn her, and of course also tricks the trickster in the process, which can only leave us wondering how both Leah and Rachel feel about this whole arrangement. Since, unlike the Schuyler sisters in Hamilton, Leah and Rachel don't have a whole lot of voice in this story. All of which has me wondering, what would have happened if someone had stopped to ask Rachel and Leah what they wanted? What would have happened if their voices had been part of the story? We'll catch a little of their voices as Leah bears child after child, 6 sons and 1 daughter in all, trying to win her husband's affection, and as Rachel, as her mother-in-law and grandmother-in-law before her, struggles with infertility. But mostly their voices are left out of the story. Over the course of this summer, many of us, or at least many of us white people, have been learning in new ways what it means not to raise up our own ideas and concerns, but to amplify the voices of people of color. As my kids have been learning this material, it's been identified as what does it take to be an ally? What does it take to be an upstander? What does it mean to use your privilege not for yourself, to stand up for others? What would it have been like if Rachel had been able to stand up for her sister Leah? What if she had been able to use her privilege as the desired daughter, the favored wife, to speak out against the treatment of Leah, so easily sold to someone who didn't want her for anything more than bearing children? What if Jacob had used his voice? And Jacob, he's getting better at realizing that it's not all about him, but he's not there yet in our story today. What would it have been for Jacob to say, Laban, you can't just cast your daughter off like that. She deserves a relationship where she is valued for being who she is. Yeah, okay. I realize that thousands of years ago, this is not how the world worked. Rachel and Leah were both property first of their father and then of their husband. And the consequences of Rachel speaking up may very well have put her safety at risk. But for us today, who are not living in Bible times, this story calls to us, telling us we do have the power to speak up. We have the power to listen to the voices of those who are in pain and then amplify those voices. We don't have to be like the suddenly silent trickster Jacob, who just goes along with his father-in-law's plans, his father-in-law's nonsense. Recently, my kids have spent part of their Thursday afternoons in basically ally training for kids. Through an online workshop, they learned about what it means to be an ally and the ways that they can use their privilege to stand up for others. The ways that they can be an upstander is what the training they did called it. They have a voice and they're called upon to use it. And they were called on to take it a step further. They were asked to name some of the privileges they have and how they are going to use their privilege to stand up for others. Friends, no one asked me to do this when I was 7 or 9 years old. But it is also the case that if we can ask 7 and 9-year-olds to name their privilege, to name the advantages they have through no fault of their own, but advantages they have nevertheless, and ask them to use them not for themselves but for others, then those of us who are older than 7 and 9 can do the same thing as well. We can recognize that there are statuses we have. For some of us, that's the color of our skin or the gender we're born with, that give us power. And it's really easy. It's the default position to use that power when we're cisgendered and born white for ourselves. But through our baptisms, in Jesus' family, we're called to use it for others. And then there are some statuses we've had to work for. Perhaps that's homeownership or a certain career or educational attainment. But for some folks, and probably many of you listening to this sermon, perhaps not all, but many, those successes tie back into the previously mentioned skin color and gender, again, especially if you're assigned cisgender male at birth. Redlining isn't so far removed from our own history, and there's certainly all sorts of systemic levels of discrimination in education and employment. And I'm not saying that you shouldn't be an educated homeowner of a certain income. I myself am part of an educated home-owning couple of a certain income. But I don't get to stop there. I've got to use my voice to speak out about Black Lives Mattering and amplify the calls to defund the police and rethink jails and prisons that come out of this movement. And I've got to speak out about protections for renters and immigrants, or totally encourage you to vote yes on Proposition 15 this November for schools and communities first in California. Okay, that one might be a little self-serving since I still have kids in the school system, but school funding is really a thing in this state and has been for a long time. Once upon a time, the trickster got tricked. He wanted something, someone, and ended up with someone else. And he rolled with it. But remaining silent and letting Laban manipulate the situation led to a pretty messy family situation as Jacob's wives competed for power and influence within their family. As I've said before with these family stories, it could have been different. There's always another way. In this case, it's finding a new way to use power and influence to change the situation. It's too late for Jacob and Rachel and Leah, but we've still got the opportunity to speak up. We've got the opportunity to say, there is a way this can be different. We can use our voices, our resources, our privilege to work towards that world that our baptisms call us into being co-creators of. And so let us find ways to use our power, to use what God has given us in order to create the world that God would have us live in. Amen.